Hello, my name is Evan Campbell, and I'm going to be discussing whether or not the European Union should allow Turkey to join as a full access member. I'm going to be arguing for the affirmative, that is, I believe Turkey should be allowed as a full access member to the EU. In order to understand the current relationship between Turkey and the European Union, one has to look all the way back to shortly after World War II. I found the best account of this to be in a journal entitled Troubled Relationships, Turkey and the European Union by Hilal Elver in the Middle East Journal in 2005. Hilal Elver is currently a lead researcher on human rights at the United Nations. In this journal, she outlines the various machinations of the relationship between Turkey and the European Union, starting in 1963, when the European Union, at that time called the European Economic Community, entered into an agreement with Turkey called the Ankara Agreement, in which the European Union outlined policies which it required Turkey to follow in order to become a member of the European Union. These included open market economic policies, removing the army from political power, and introducing openly democratic elections. In the next several decades, Turkey did very little to act on any of these policies, and in some instances probably acted against the EU's desires, resulting in a very troubled relationship. But by 1993, the European Union was looking to include more members in order to improve its future economic opportunities. In order to do so, it released a series of papers called the Copenhagen Criteria, which outlined the policies which Turkey and other Cold War Eastern Bloc countries would have to follow in order to become a member of the EU. These included policies for helping minority groups avoid persecution with regards to Syria, the Christians, Yazidis, and women, as well as the various policies included in the original Ankara Agreement. This time around, Turkey did several things to improve its position with the European Union, including two drastic revisions of its constitution, which changed human rights policies, how people were elected, and removed a lot of the government's power, removed a lot of the army's power from any political positions, as well as a group called the AKP, which were a soft Islamist party. This group came into power, and they felt that the religious policies shouldn't influence political policies, which was previously unheard of in Turkey. So coming up to 2005, Turkey was in a much better position with the European Union than ever before, and the European Union considered or entered into talks with Turkey about entering the European Union, which had somewhat stalled. The events which precipitate the discussion of Turkey's involvement with the European Union yet again is the instability which is currently occurring in the Middle East, which has had drastic effects on Turkey as well as the European Union. Over the past several years, we've seen severe uprisings throughout the Middle East, most spectacularly in Syria, which has had by far the greatest influence on both Turkey and the European Union. The UN has estimated that in this civil war between the current president, or whatever you want to call him, Bashar al-Assad, and the various minority groups he's fighting against, over 250,000 civilians have died. 9.5 million civilians have been displaced, 2 million of these ending up in Turkey, and over 1 million of these ending up in EU countries. The EU has really had trouble handling this. Germany and France are no longer accepting any more refugees, as these refugees have overwhelmed the security, the safety net which these countries have been able to provide, as well as creating a cultural schism between the populations of these countries and the refugees which are incoming. Not only that, but these refugees have provided cover for a series of extremist groups' terrorist attacks, most recently in Brussels and Paris, which the EU countries have shown very little ability to prevent. So coming up to kind of the crux of the argument, as the European Union has attempted to alleviate the situation which has resulted in all these refugees, has resulted in these terrorist attacks, it has been totally unsuccessful at providing any help or starting any discussion with Bashar al-Assad or the minority forces in Syria. It doesn't have the relationships. It never really tried to over the past several decades. So it is kind of a lame duck in this civil war. It is in an interesting position with regards to Turkey, because Turkey shares a border not only with Syria, but with Iraq and Iran, and has fostered relationships not only with the governments there, but with minority groups in each of those three countries over the past decade. As Christopher Phillips outlines in a Chatham Press release from 2012 called Into the Quagmire, Turkey's Syria Policy. As recently as 2009, Syria and Turkey had over $1 billion in trade. In 2008, the PM of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, went on a vacation with the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. So there was a huge relationship between the two, which no other European Union country can claim. Not only that, but following this civil war, Turkey has been involved with all of the minority factions in Syria, whether that be supplying weapons or providing information to them in an attempt to promote democracy in Syria. As such, Turkey has avenues of discussion with all sides of the Syrian conflict that European Union nations cannot possibly have. And if the European Union was to include Turkey, it would have an ally who was instrumental in an event which is probably the most significant event occurring in the Middle East as well as in Europe right now. I believe that if the European Union was to accept Turkey, they would have a much better chance at furthering any talks with Bashar al-Assad or the minority groups in finding peace, in introducing democracy in Syria. Whatever the case may be, the European Union's best avenue for furthering its goals in the Middle East is to allow Turkey to join. Looking at a bigger picture, Turkey, unbeknownst to many, actually now has the second largest army of all NATO members. And due to its geopolitical position between Europe and the Middle East, it's at the crux of any war which would occur between Europe and the Middle East. So, for example, looking at ISIS, if ISIS was to become even more powerful, to hold even more territory, and decided it wanted to mount more serious attacks on Europe, the primary defender of Europe would be Turkey. The primary way for European forces to enter into Syria to attack ISIS would be Turkey. And the biggest defense group, or the biggest army which could possibly defend Europe, would be Turkey. So looking at it on a big picture or a small picture scale, politically and militarily, Turkey is the greatest prospective ally that Europe has in its current problem with the troubles going on in the Middle East. And as such, if Turkey was to join the European Union, it could be hugely influential in helping the European Union further its own goals in promoting peace in the Middle East and in ending the Syrian conflict.